At this point in my life, I often find myself asking the omnipresent and endlessly nebulous question, who am I? It's not a question that lends itself to being answered in any functional way, as it searches for an answer that's endlessly both vague and complicated. So how do we answer this question for ourselves? How do we take the enormous amounts of information that comprise our identities and understand them? We can try and begin on a completely literal level, with given identities, labels given to us by society. Take a moment to consider your nationality, sexuality, gender, and ethnicity. What do those traits mean to you? Are they deeply important labels that affect your everyday experience, or are they incidental, things you rarely think about? To name a few of my traits, I'm male, homosexual, American, and of Jewish descent. Now, this isn't a conventional way to view identity. With a more nuanced modern understanding of the impact of stereotypes, it's easy to argue that to reduce identity to a question of religion, gender, and sexuality is a radical and offensive oversimplification. And in some ways, this is true. Nothing about me is inherently different because I'm male or gay or Jewish, but at the same time, these identities have colored my life and how I've lived it. I would never have had to come out if I wasn't gay, wouldn't have dealt with toxic masculinity if I wasn't male, and wouldn't have had a bar mitzvah, a Jewish coming-of-age ceremony, if I wasn't Jewish. It's not the identities that society has assigned to me that matter, but the way that I've reacted to them. So let's take these labels and add nuance. Each is a process of thought, a relationship to a label rather than the label itself. To give an example, my Jewish identity is not a birthright, but a narrative of trying to come to terms with a deeply tragic history and to reconcile it with my modern privilege in the modern day, referring, of course, to the Holocaust. Growing up as a child in Cambodia, this gave me a certain sense of insight into that nation's struggle with the brutal and murderous Khmer Rouge regime just 40 years before I arrived there. Now, this transition from viewing labels as given to us to narratives allows us to see ourselves in others who may seem very different from us. In creating relationships with others, we have the tendency to take these traits at face value. We all have our preconceptions about what different traits mean, and that can manifest itself in prejudice, often with disastrous effects. 100 years ago, you could be arrested for being gay or afforded special privileges for being male. And there's a strong argument to be made that in the modern day, these traits maintain similar implications. Many nations still refuse legal equalities such as same-sex marriage to LGBTQ+ populations, and an important narrative about unhealthy sexual dynamics between men and women has taken center stage in the modern media. And yet, we undoubtedly have progressed. So how do we move forward in our relationships with others? Do we begin to make assumptions about them based on their traits? This would be problematic in and of itself, and counter to the attempt to reclassify labels as narratives. We must remain open, allowing no barriers to the forms of identification or expression that we allow others, nor those that we allow ourselves. We must allow people to educate us on what their identities mean to them and in what way they have affected their lives. As an international community, these identities often become confused. Nationality in the face of internationalism often leads to cynicism towards the nations from which a person originates. At our international school, a foreign student may feel disconnected from their nationality by studying in English, or they may feel a desire to hold on to it despite the language of their education. Similarly, an American may feel disconnected from their nationality by studying outside of their country of birth, or they may decide to hold on to it despite their location. What's important about that example is that the relationship to that label of nationality overrides the importance of the nationality itself. And it allows people to see themselves in others who, while on the face are different, maintain the same narratives in terms of how they've come to terms with the identities that society has assigned to them. The important difference between this method of thought and traditional identity politics is that the trait itself holds no inherent meaning and is decided by personal interpretation. This philosophy of context persists throughout and is inherently important to what I'm trying to say. In our international school community, we have chosen to divide ourselves by a series of labels. Economics, race, sexuality, gender, and nationality all serve to limit our social circles further than the already existing constraints of our small international school. We all need to question not only how we categorize others, but also how we categorize ourselves, allowing no limitations to the manifestations of identity that we see as legitimate in anyone. I would be lying if I said that I was never hesitant to include a classmate due to their mother tongue or their nationality, or that I never took the cost of a peer's clothing as a statement about their personality. The effect of a trait is broad and variable, affecting different people differently. When we become absorbed in the inherently flawed presupposition that particular traits have inherent consistent effects, we begin to make unsubstantiated judgments about others, and it becomes more difficult to expand our social circle. When we allow people to decide for themselves what their identities mean, we reduce the meaning of barriers that we build based on religion, nationality, and ethnicity. To come together, we must be able to redefine and reinterpret the narratives and implications around our identities. Christian, atheist, Bulgarian, American, affluent, middle class, more than any other community, we must be able to redefine who it is that the world tells us we are. Thank you.